Hello, welcome to Radio 4's Consumer Programme. Now, it's no exaggeration to say that fraud has reached epidemic proportions in the UK, which is why we give it such a high profile here on You and Yours. In the year June to June 2019, they were getting on for 4 million cases in the UK, making up more than a third of all crime. Everything from card fraud, people impersonating your bank and tricking you into transferring your money, dodgy investments to get you to part with your pension, to fraudsters pretending they love you and getting hold of your cash that way. So is there any reason to suppose that we're more vulnerable in the UK? Is it just us? Which is why we've assembled an international panel. 3 women, all looking for answers. Lucy Cormack is the crime reporter of the Sydney Morning Herald. She was in New South Wales. Anna Kloosspies is an investigative journalist for Bayerischer Rundfunk, the public service Bavarian Broadcasting Corporation. She was in Munich, and our own Shari Val. And I got Shari first to explain what she wanted to establish with this discussion that we didn't know already.
I suppose the main point is that are we alone in the planet of being such a major target for fraud? Knowing that fraud is a third of all crime in the UK is quite something. And in fact, if you add the cyber element, it becomes half of all crime.
So let's ask our other guests, how bad are things where you are? Lucy Cormack, let me start with you. What's the fraud landscape in Australia?
Oh, look, it's substantial as well. Just this year alone, Australians have lost more than $500 million to frauds and scams. And that is a figure that just keeps growing. We're talking about attempts to steal people's personal identities, buying and selling fraud, dating and romance scams, fake charities, fake investment schemes, threats and extortion, even kidnapping. The problem is massive, and I think the digital age has only increased it exponentially.
Now, Anna Kloosspies, what are the kinds of frauds which are the hot fraud of the moment, if you like, in Germany?
What we do see is a massive increase in fraud with fake goods, counterfeiting. We have a damage made of 50 billion euros every year, with China being the biggest, let's say, market in bringing in those counterfeited goods. There's still like a solid amount of fraud, as you mentioned, let's say internet fraud, but we also have a specific fraud that is called the police trick. So they're usually based in Turkey in huge phone centers, and they pretend to be policemen calling elderly people in Germany, asking them to hand over money because it's not supposed to be safe anymore. And what we saw is that from 2008 up until 2018, that increased massively as well.
And I gather one thing you don't have as much as we do, I mentioned pension fraud. This is people investing their pensions in things which people have told them will make them rich and never have to worry again. Am I right in thinking that is not so common in Germany?
Yes, you're absolutely right. And I would say this is because German investors, they are quite traditional, they're quite conservative, and they are very careful, yes, and they would not like to take risks and, investing their pension into anything that doesn't look 100,000% safe. And also we have this very tight net of the state pension system here in Germany. I was highly surprised when I first learned about the pension fraud system in the UK. I mean, this seems to be huge, and we don't have anything similar here in Germany.
And Shari, give us some perspective on that, because that is basically because a recent change in the law, isn't it? Yeah.
It is. In the UK, the pension rules changed in 2011, which allowed people much greater freedom to access their pensions. And of course, what happened is the criminals and the salesmen on commission decided that that's where the pots of money were. That's what they were going to access, and they didn't care how they got it. And what we've seen is upwards of £1 billion of losses over the last 5 years in terms of people's pensions being invested into unsafe, unregulated, high-risk schemes that then their money completely disappears.
So a lot of people in this country often find it very hard to get someone to listen to them or indeed investigate their fraud, don't they?
Yes, in the UK we have a thing called Action Fraud, which is the only place in the UK where you can report your fraud. It's the National Fraud Reporting Centre. Now, the problem with Action Fraud is the title, actually. Everybody believes when they report their fraud that they will get action, that it will be investigated. And that simply isn't true. Only about 28% are investigated. But they're not investigated investigated by Action Fraud. That's passed on to another body called the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau, which then decides whether or not it's going to send intelligence to the police to actually investigate. Now, that blockage causes people frustration in this country.
So what would you like to put to Lucy, and Anna, but Lucy first, about trying to find out what solutions we are not adopting?
Well, I'd like to ask Lucy, if you are defrauded in Australia, what do? Do you walk into a police station, or do you have a central reporting system? Is it harder, easier to report fraud in Australia?
We struggle with the same things here in Australia. I mean, as you would know, so often these bad actors and these criminals are often overseas and so hard to trace. Here in Australia, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission is the main federal body that runs this, and they have a thing called Scam Watch, which perhaps is a little bit like Action Fraud, and similar sort of structure. You go online, you can log your scam, all of the details, but of course the likelihood of you ever really getting your money back is extremely low. And even the ACCC says that quite clearly on their website. If you have given money and your personal details over to a scammer, you are unlikely to get them back.
Can I put that to Anna?
We have an institution called the Consumer Advice Center. We have it because Germany is a federalistic system, basically in every state, but we also have one for the whole of Germany. It's in a place where you can address that you've been defrauded, for instance. They hand out information on what you should write down, what is important if you feel like you've been defrauded, and they even help you with filing a report with the police. So I'd say this is quite a special thing. Yeah.
So people do get listened to. I think that's what you're saying, which, Shari, is something that people don't feel here, don't they?
Yeah, they definitely feel that the authorities are not listening. Don't forget, there's a background of enormous cuts in the police service. So the first things to go in many police services around the country, and there are 43 forces of England and Wales, was the fraud squads.
Lucy, we've already heard from Anna that there are certain kinds of frauds which aren't happening there. What about Australia in terms of fashion?
Criminals in Australia, if you like, have a very seasonal approach to the way they target Australians. Tax time is a very common time of year that people will get emails that are mocked up, and they are very convincing to look as though they're from the Australian Tax Office. Then again, of course, around Valentine's Day, the romance scams really spike up.
I'd like to ask Anna about the romance fraud in Germany, because I bet there isn't nearly as much as there is in the UK.
I would say that's quite a new phenomenon, also that the police is not really familiar with right now. Just recently, we had Munich Customs at the airport warning people, sending out a warning saying that almost once a week they have someone waiting there at the airport, for their loved one from Nigeria or somewhere from Western Africa. And so we really see an increase in that romance fraud. But I think the German police is not really aware of that phenomenon.
So is there anything you can think of that you do that is so imaginative that you think we ought to be trying it?
We have many informations that have been given out through the advice centres, but also the police is doing a massive information campaign on the internet, also even through television. There's a very famous TV show. Well, it's basically a detective show that depicts real frauds, asking people to dial in, giving information. So there is, we can help one another, but also they inform me about recent frauds that are going on.
The big message that we get here in Australia, and thus why authorities and the government and police really want to work closely with the media with these sorts of scams and frauds, is education and making people aware. So particularly around these times of year, they run massive campaigns that are just saturated in the media in every format, from television to radio to signage around the city, in stores, everywhere, just to remind people about these sorts of things. The other thing that we have is an organisation called ID Care. Now, this is a not-for-profit charity. So when someone loses control of their identity, they really help you go in and scan the web. They give you support, psychological counselling, because it can be very distressing, of course. So these are some of the organisations that have cropped up around this.
Shari, you called this conference and time is tight. Is there anything you want to put to Lucy or Anna?
Well, actually, the thing that strikes me from the Australian examples that Lucy has told us about is the willingness of the government and other institutions to be very public about it and to consider that education and talking about it is really important.
Well, and Anna's German example of the television programme, that seems, because we've got nothing like that, have we? We have not got a fraud crime watch other than you and yours.
No, other than you and yours, we don't have Fraud Watch. We do have Rip Off Britain. Bearing in mind, fraud and cyber is half of all crime. That might be a good thing to do. But the other thing that Anna said, which was really interesting, is how the culture in Germany is to be more careful. And perhaps we could learn quite a lot in the UK about being more careful.
And that was our reporter Shari Val talking to me earlier, along with Anna Clues-Spies and Lucy Cormack.